Thomas Hartwell's calloused fingers trembled as he pressed the cold steel of his Colt against Deputy Clayton Brooks's temple. The saloon had gone dead silent. Even the piano player's hands froze above the keys. "You got 10 seconds to tell me where the girl's brother is," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 5 years' worth of buried guilt. "Or I become the killer you all think I already am." Brooks's eyes darted toward the stairs leading to the second floor, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the February chill seeping through the saloon's cracked windows. Behind them, Rose McKenna stood in the doorway, her silk dress torn at the shoulder, revealing the purple bruises that told a story no decent man should have to witness. But this wasn't about decency anymore. This was about the moment when a man who'd spent half a decade running from his demons finally stopped running and started hunting. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for violence. They didn't know that Thomas Hartwell had once been Sheriff Thomas Hartwell. They didn't know about the innocent Lakota boy whose blood still stained his dreams. All they knew was that the quiet rancher from Cedar Valley had finally snapped. And in 10 seconds, they'd learn what happened when a man with nothing left to lose decided that some sins were worth repeating. What would he choose? His soul or her brother's life? If you're feeling that tension already, drop a comment letting us know where you're reading from. This story's about to get a whole lot more dangerous. 3 months earlier, the autumn leaves were still clinging to the cottonwoods when Rose McKenna first walked up Thomas Hartwell's porch steps. She moved like smoke across water, graceful, but with something dark trailing behind her. Thomas had been mending fence posts, his hands steady despite the whiskey he'd been nursing since dawn. 5 years of exile had taught him that some mornings required liquid courage just to face the mirror. "Mr. Hartwell?" Her voice carried the refined edges of Eastern education, softened by something that sounded like desperation. "I'm looking for work." He looked up from the post he'd been hammering, and for a moment forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful in the way wildfire was beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of burning everything down. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green as bottle glass, and just as sharp. They held secrets that went deeper than the Montana mines. "Can you cook?" he asked, trying to ignore the way her traveling dress clung to curves that had no business distracting a man who'd sworn off complications. "Among other things." The way she said it sent heat crawling up his spine. That first night she cooked beans and cornbread that tasted better than anything he'd eaten since leaving his badge in Sheriff Kane's desk drawer. But it was the way she moved around his kitchen, confident, claiming space like she belonged there, that made him wonder what kind of trouble he'd just invited into his life. She took the cabin out back without complaint, though he caught her studying the sight lines to the main road. Smart woman. In his experience, the smart ones were either the safest or the most dangerous. With Rose McKenna, he was beginning to suspect the latter. The first month passed quietly. She kept house, he worked cattle. In the evenings, they'd sit on opposite ends of his porch, sharing whiskey and silence, while the sun painted the valley gold. Sometimes he'd catch her watching him with those green eyes, and he'd feel something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with lust and everything to do with longing. But longing was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. It was mid-November when he found the blood. He'd gone to check on her after she'd missed breakfast, something that never happened. Rose McKenna was as reliable as sunrise until she wasn't. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, morning frost melting on the threshold. Inside, he found droplets of blood on the wooden floor. Not much, but enough to tell a story. They led from the door to the wash basin, where a blood-stained cloth lay crumpled beside a bar of lye soap. But it wasn't her blood. Thomas had seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between victim and aggressor. This blood belonged to someone else. Someone who'd bled in Rose McKenna's cabin and then disappeared like smoke. When she returned an hour later, her hair was slightly mussed, and there was mud on her boots that didn't match anything on his property. She moved differently too, like a woman who'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "Morning, Mr. Hartwell." Her voice carried its usual calm, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. "Coffee's on the stove." He followed her into the main house, studying the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided his eyes. Whatever had happened in that cabin, it had shaken her. And despite every instinct screaming at him to mind his own business, Thomas Hartwell found himself caring more than was safe. "Everything all right, Rose?" She paused in the act of pouring coffee, her hand steady as stone. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because there's blood in your cabin and shadows in your eyes," he thought. "Because you're running from something, and I'm fool enough to want to help you run." Instead, he said, "No reason," and accepted the coffee cup from her fingers. When their skin touched, just for a moment, he felt her shiver. Not from cold, but from something that made his blood run thick and slow. That night, he watched from his bedroom window as Deputy Clayton Brooks rode up to her cabin. Even in the moonlight, he could see the arrogance in the man's posture, the way he dismounted like he owned every inch of ground his boots touched. Brooks didn't knock. He pushed through Rose's door like he had every right to be there, and Thomas felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. He reached for the gun belt hanging on his bedpost, then stopped. Getting involved would mean questions. Questions would mean explanations about who he used to be and why he wasn't Sheriff Thomas Hartwell anymore. But when he heard Rose cry out, just once, sharp and pained, explanations stopped mattering. By the time he reached her cabin, Brooks was gone. Rose sat on her narrow bed, holding a damp cloth to her split lip. In the lamplight, her skin looked pale as bone, and there were finger-shaped bruises forming on her wrist. "Rose!" Her name came out rougher than he intended. She looked up at him with those bottle-green eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw her mask slip. Underneath the composed exterior was a woman at the end of her rope, holding on by her fingernails. "He knows," she whispered. "Knows what?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Who I really am." That's when she told him. About Judge McKenna, her father, who'd been poisoned for refusing to look the other way when Brooks and his associates needed legal protection. About the evidence she'd gathered proving not just Brooks's corruption, but an entire network of graft that stretched from Cedar Falls to the territorial capital. And about her 15-year-old brother, currently being held in a Denver boarding house that was really a prison, insurance against her cooperation. "He visits me twice a week," she said, touching the bruise on her wrist. "Takes his payment for keeping quiet about who killed my father." "What kind of payment?" Thomas asked, though the bruises on her skin already told that story. Rose met his eyes, and in that moment, he saw something that made his chest tight. Not just pain, but a fierce, burning anger that matched his own. The kind that makes a woman feel like she's dying a little more each time. Thomas sat down beside her on the bed, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. She smelled like lavender soap and something uniquely her. Something that made him want to pull her close and promise that no one would ever hurt her again. Instead, he reached out and gently touched the corner of her split lip with his thumb. "Not anymore." She leaned into his touch, and he felt her breath catch. "You don't understand. He's not just corrupt, he's dangerous. And there are men backing him, Men with more power than a simple rancher can fight. Maybe. Thomas traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips, watching her eyes flutter closed. But I'm not as simple as you think. When she opened her eyes again, there was something new there. Hope, maybe. Or hunger. He couldn't tell which was more dangerous. Who are you, Thomas Hartwell? He should have pulled away then, should have told her that some questions were better left unasked. Instead, he found himself leaning closer, until he could count the gold flecks in her green eyes. Someone who used to believe in justice, he said, before I learned that justice and law aren't always the same thing. And now? His thumb traced her lower lip, careful of the cut. Now I'm starting to remember why I believed in the first place. She kissed him then, soft and desperate, and tasting of copper from her split lip. It was the kind of kiss that came from two people who'd been alone too long, who'd found something in each other worth fighting for. When they broke apart, her hands were fisted in his shirt, and he could feel her heart racing against his chest. Thomas, she whispered, there's something else. Something I haven't told you. But before she could finish, they heard horses approaching. Brooks's voice carried through the thin cabin walls, but he wasn't alone this time. 3 other men by the sound of it, and they weren't here for a social visit. Get dressed, Thomas said, already moving toward where he'd left his gun belt. We're leaving. I can't run anymore, Rose said, but she was already reaching for her boots. If I disappear, they'll kill my brother. Then we don't disappear. Thomas buckled his holster, the familiar weight of the Colt settling against his hip like an old friend. We end this. Outside, Brooks was shouting orders to his men. Something about searching the property, about not letting anyone leave alive. Thomas felt the old coldness settling over him, the same ice-water calm that had made him a good sheriff and a dangerous man. Stay behind me, he told Rose, and whatever happens, don't look back. They slipped out the cabin's rear window just as Brooks kicked in the front door. In the moonlight, Thomas could see the deputy's 3 companions spreading out to surround the building. Professional killers, by the way they moved. This wasn't about corrupt money anymore. This was about silencing witnesses. He and Rose made it to the tree line before the shooting started. Brooks had realized the cabin was empty and was taking out his frustration on Thomas's furniture. The sound of splintering wood carried across the valley like gunshots. The barn, Rose whispered. There's something I need to show you. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, using every shadow and depression in the land. Thomas found himself remembering skills he'd tried to forget, how to move silently, how to read the night, how to become invisible when visibility meant death. In the barn, Rose led him to a loose board in the back stall. Behind it was a leather satchel containing documents, photographs, and a small fortune in bills marked with territorial banking seals. My father's insurance policy, she explained. Evidence of every payoff, every fixed case, every murder they covered up, including yours. Thomas went very still. Mine. Little Wolf. She pulled out a photograph of a young Lakota man, barely 18. He wasn't a cattle thief, Thomas. He was investigating the disappearance of tribal money. Money that Brooks and his associates had stolen from the reservation. The world tilted sideways. For 5 years, Thomas had carried the guilt of killing an innocent man. But it was worse than that. He'd killed a man who'd been seeking the same justice that Thomas had sworn to uphold. You knew, he said. From the beginning, you knew who I was. I knew you were the sheriff who'd left town after the shooting. I didn't know you were a good man until I lived under your roof for 3 months. The sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation. Brooks and his men had finished searching the cabin and were expanding their hunt. There's a back trail through the canyon, Thomas said. You can make it to Kane's place by dawn. Give him the evidence. Tell him everything. What about you? Thomas checked his ammunition, muscle memory guiding his hands. I'm going to do what I should have done 5 years ago. I'm going to finish the job. Rose caught his arm as he turned to go. Don't do this for revenge. Don't become the killer they painted you as. He looked down at her, this woman who'd brought chaos and hope into his carefully ordered exile. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it for redemption. She kissed him again, fierce and urgent, pouring all her fear and need into the contact. When they broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Come back to me, she whispered. Count on it. But as Thomas slipped out into the night, he wondered if that was a promise he could keep. The showdown came at dawn in the Cedar Falls Saloon, exactly where these kinds of stories always end. Thomas walked through the batwing doors to find Brooks waiting for him, flanked by his hired guns and half the corrupt establishment that had poisoned this valley. But he wasn't alone. Marshal Kane stood at the bar, Rose's evidence spread across the mahogany surface like an indictment, and in the corner, surprising everyone, sat the 3 tribal elders who'd come to witness justice for Little Wolf. Thomas Hartwell, Brooks sneered, his hand hovering over his gun. Come to play hero? Come to finish what I started 5 years ago, Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Though back then, I didn't know I was hunting the wrong man. The confrontation that followed wasn't the clean, heroic violence of dime novels. It was brutal and desperate, with Brooks using every dirty trick he knew. But when the smoke cleared, it was the corrupt deputy who lay bleeding on the sawdust floor, finally brought to account for his crimes. 3 weeks later, Thomas found Rose on his porch, watching the sunset paint the valley gold. Her brother had been safely returned, the corruption network dismantled, and Brooks was awaiting trial in the territorial prison. So what now? She asked as he settled beside her, close enough to feel her warmth in the evening chill. Thomas thought about redemption, about second chances, about the way some sins could be transformed into something like grace. Now we see if a used-up ex-sheriff and a judge's daughter can build something worth keeping in this valley. Rose smiled, the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her. I think we already have. As darkness settled over Cedar Falls, Thomas Hartwell finally understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing what to build from the pieces that remained. And sometimes, if a man was lucky enough, he found someone willing to help him build it. Some stories end with justice, others with love. The best ones end with both. If this tale moved something in you, there are more where this came from. Stories of the West where hearts heal and heroes are forged in the fires of their own mistakes. Subscribe to Hear Them All and let us know in the comments which part made your heart race the fastest.